Do you believe people can really change? Or do they just get better at hiding things?
At dinner, Mom smiled with that carefully rehearsed expression she always wore when she thought she was about to deliver a compliment wrapped in poison. She placed her napkin across her lap, leaned toward me as though this conversation were a private one, and announced for the entire table to hear, "Your brother's housewarming was wonderful. When will you finally catch up?" Her fork glinted in the light as she lifted it toward her mouth, certain she had just landed a harmless jab, but I was already prepared. I set my glass down, let the pause stretch until every eye turned toward me, and answered calmly, "I already did last year. But you wouldn't know, since you weren't invited." Her fork froze in the air, and for once, she had nothing ready to follow with. The silence that followed was sharp, almost surgical. Dad coughed and shifted in his chair as if the sound could mask his discomfort, while Ryan smirked across the table, thinking I was bluffing. Mom blinked, her lips parting just slightly, as though she had to search for the right response, but I gave her none of the relief she wanted. I took a sip of water, stared straight at the tablecloth, and let her sit in the sudden weight of words she had never expected me to deliver. For years, she had thrown me into the shadow of my brother's successes, using him as the constant benchmark I was supposed to live up to, and for years I had learned to swallow it, to smile at the right moments, and to pretend I wasn't keeping a running ledger of every slight. That night, however, I decided I wasn't going to pretend anymore. The truth is that I had caught up long before Ryan ever bought his shiny suburban box and threw a party to celebrate his arrival into adulthood. I had spent years working in silence, paying off debts, juggling 2 jobs when nobody asked how I was holding up, building something brick by brick without a word of encouragement from the people who were supposed to cheer the loudest. Ryan could misplace his wallet at the gas station, and Mom would call it being too busy with important things, while if I dared to forget a phone bill, she would lecture me about responsibility. At 16, he was handed a used Honda with a red bow on it, while I was told I could borrow the minivan as long as I filled the tank myself. At 20, he needed help with tuition, and Dad co-signed without blinking, while I was told that working through college builds character. I carried those reminders in my chest like stones, and every time I thought of giving in, I remembered how light Ryan's pockets always were, and how full mine had to be just to stand in the same room. By the time I graduated, I had stopped looking at them for approval. I smiled at the ceremonies, I posed for the pictures, but I knew the applause was always louder when Ryan entered the room, even if he was just bringing takeout. When I signed the paperwork for my first house, I didn't tell them. I didn't even hint at it. I quietly packed my rented apartment, carried boxes into the new space, and sat on the bare hardwood floors with a slice of pizza, realizing that for the first time in my life I had done something monumental and didn't crave their reaction. That night I decided there would be no family tour, no photo of me holding keys with Mom beaming in the background. I had learned to build alone, and so I celebrated alone, or at least with people who didn't see me as second place. I hosted a party with friends from work, neighbors I had just met, and a couple of college friends who knew exactly how many night shifts I had suffered through to get there. We raised glasses in the backyard, laughed until midnight, and wrote messages in a guest book I had bought at the last minute. Each page was filled with reminders that I had a family, just not the one whose last name I carried. I tucked that book onto a shelf and told myself I would keep it safe, not realizing how often I would flip through it later on nights when the silence from my parents felt heavier than it should have. So when Mom leaned across that table with her fork in the air and asked me when I would finally catch up, she didn't know she had already missed the moment. She had missed the late nights spent painting walls until my arms ached, the weekends spent assembling furniture, the mornings when I watered my own grass and felt absurdly proud of something so ordinary. She had missed every milestone, not because I hadn't wanted her there, but because I already knew how she would have diminished it, how she would have smiled politely and then found a way to turn it into a comparison. "Nice place," she would have said, but Ryan's kitchen has granite counters. I wasn't going to give her the chance. At that table, while her fork trembled between plate and mouth, I saw her trying to decide whether I was bluffing, whether this was just another attempt to get attention. But I didn't blink. I kept my tone light, even amused, because the more casual I seemed, the more it unsettled her. For once, she didn't have the script. For once, Ryan wasn't the star of the story. I had taken control of the narrative, and it rattled her in a way I had never seen. Dad cleared his throat again, shifting his eyes to the window as though something outside was fascinating enough to excuse his silence. Ryan set down his glass a little too loudly, a warning that he was ready to defend her if needed, but I didn't give him an opening. The tension hung there like smoke, thick and impossible to escape. I leaned back, twirled my fork in the pasta on my plate, and smiled without looking at any of them. The power wasn't in arguing or in defending my choices. It was in letting them wonder what they had missed, what part of my life had unfolded without their knowledge. And as the quiet stretched longer, I felt something settle inside me, not peace, exactly, but something close to it. For the first time, I wasn't chasing their acknowledgement. I had taken it off the table entirely, and they didn't know what to do with the empty space left behind. That silence, that single moment when every person at the table waited for me to fill the gap, was worth every lie of omission, every secret move, every hidden receipt I had kept tucked away. And as I pushed my plate slightly forward and rested my hands in my lap, I thought to myself that this was only the beginning of what they still didn't know. The thing about silence is that it does not arrive empty. It drags in a caravan of old scenes and unflattering truths, and as my mother's fork hovered like a little chrome pendulum that had finally found reason to hesitate, I felt the long tale of our family history unspool across the table, the years in which my brother's missed assignments were renamed ambitions and my careful plans were demoted to chores, the birthdays where his late entrance counted as sparkle and my well-timed cake counted as obligation, the evenings when I learned to nod along while the compliments flew past me like birds that refused to land, and I realized that this dinner was not a new argument at all but a rerun with a new ending that I had quietly written in advance. When I was finishing high school and counting tips in the back room of a diner that smelled permanently of coffee and onion rings, my brother got the kind of talk that ends with keys clinking into a palm, while my version of guidance arrived as a spreadsheet of costs and a cheerful remark about how independence builds backbone, and maybe it did. Because by the time I signed my first lease, I understood that there are families who lend umbrellas and families who ask how you forgot yours, and mine had perfected the latter with a smug kind of elegance that could pass for care if you did not look closely. I learned to keep my mouth shut, to keep receipts, to step over the little digs with the balance of a gymnast, and to build a life that depended on my own hands rather than waiting for a lifeline that existed only as a story they liked to tell about themselves. College did not soften the lesson, it only added zeros, because while my brother's textbooks became decorative objects he abandoned on the couch between weekend trips, mine were rented by the week and returned like small victories. And when his tuition hit a snag, our parents became patrons and saints in a single afternoon. But when my second job started to chew up sleep and leave me studying on the bus, Mom's advice was that hard work builds grit, which would have been a beautiful philosophy if it had been evenly distributed. By the time I graduated, I had stopped expecting anything gentler than a polite shrug, so I did what practical people do when hope turns brittle. I kept going, I stacked paychecks. I learned about interest rates in the kind of detail people who are handed keys never really learn, and I made a promise that when I finally crossed the line they kept moving on me, I would not hand them the scissors to cut the ribbon. The first time my brother came to me with money talk, he couched it in the language of sibling teamwork, a little bridge loan for a down payment, nothing dramatic, just a few months to help him secure the dream. And he grinned with that charming laziness that always made adults want to adopt his problems, but I had already stopped doing interest-free charity for people who rolled their eyes at my overtime. So I told him I would be glad to help under one very boring condition, a written agreement with dates and amounts and a simple clause that said I would not be the one paying for his sudden allergies to calendars. He laughed as though I were auditioning for Accountant of the Year. He said family does not write contracts. And I said that in my experience, family loves saying that until the bill gets awkward, and then their memories fall down a well. When Mom called to smooth it over, she used that tone that sounds like a ribbon on a brick, telling me that I was making things complicated and that generosity is measured by warmth, not paperwork. And I responded with a politeness that I had refined over many years, explaining that I was done playing silent investor in stories where my name never appears in the acknowledgments, and that if anyone wanted to accuse me of being cold, they could do it after reading the email I had just sent our little trio, a neat one-page policy written in plain English about how I do not mix lending with family, how I am happy to gift what I can afford and never speak of it again, and how any request above that becomes a business matter, which protects relationships far better than drama does. She went quiet for a second, then shifted into disappointment, and I chose not to entertain it because I had already practiced a more elegant kind of revenge than an argument. That winter, instead of funneling emergency dollars into the bottomless pit of my brother's plans, I walked into the community college where I had once stapled handouts in the tutoring center and set up a small scholarship in our family name for students working more than one job, a tidy yearly gift that I could afford. A gesture that did not make me a hero but did make me someone other than the household cash dispenser, and on Christmas Eve, when Mom toasted our family's tradition of showing up for each other, I let the irony sit there while she opened a card from the college thanking the donors, her eyes skimming the letter until she reached the sentence that named me as the contributor, and her mouth did that tight little purse it does when reality refuses to match the story she prefers, and the room felt lopsided in a new way that I did not rush to balance. It was petty in the calmest possible register, but it landed, and I slept very well. Back at the restaurant, the server refilled water like none of us were suffocating on history. The light slid across the framed cityscape on the wall, and my brother started talking loudly about square footage as though he could drown me out with measurements. And I let him, because I had no interest in wrestling a bullhorn away from a man who never stopped enjoying the sound of his own good fortune, while my revenge for the evening would remain almost invisible, a gesture so simple it would pass for manners unless you knew the backstory. When the check arrived, I asked to see it, adjusted the tip upward just slightly, and slid my card across before anyone could perform the usual ritual of Dad's wallet and Mom's flattery. Then I tucked the receipt into my purse beside a small linen envelope that had sat there for over a year like a sleeping alarm clock, and I felt the tiniest thrill of anticipation because I knew the moment to open it was finally drawing breath. I did not gloat, I did not grandstand. I simply paid and thanked the server, and when Mom began another monologue about how the market is brutal for people who do not have help, I smiled and said that help is overrated if it comes with strings that double as leashes, and I watched her reach for a reply that would restore the old balance, the one where I apologize for sounding ungrateful and Ryan smirks on cue, but she could not find it, because the table had tilted toward a version of me she had not rehearsed for. The version who writes her own conditions and does not flinch, and as the plates were cleared and the conversation tried to behave, I rested my hand on the purse where the linen envelope waited and thought about the night I moved into my house. The sound of my own keys in a lock that belonged only to me, and the guest book on the entry table where people who actually knew me wrote things my mother never said. I kept that book for a reason. I kept the envelope for this dinner. And when I finally take it out, she will understand both why she was not invited and why this story is only going to get more uncomfortable. The year I disappeared from their scoreboard did not look dramatic from the outside, because there were no champagne towers or speech-worthy announcements, only long Saturdays that smelled like fresh lumber and primer, an inbox full of boring confirmations, and evenings when I stood barefoot on cold hardwood with a slice of takeout pizza and the soft shock of realizing that this key, this door, and this silence belonged to me alone, which felt almost indecent after so many years of living like a tenant in other people's expectations, and because I wanted the foundation to be honest rather than performative, I allowed myself the slow pleasure of decisions no one could downgrade at the next holiday. From the heavy slate paint I rolled across the living room wall to the stubborn choice to keep the original windows, because the light that falls through old glass is kinder than any upgrade a brochure can promise. I learned the names of my neighbors the way a person learns a new city, with little pockets of intimacy that do not require a bloodline. A retired math teacher who loaned me a sander and told me to go with the grain because life rewards patience. A nurse who worked nights and waved at dawn with the weary pride of someone who knows exactly what it costs to show up. A single dad who let his daughter draw chalk galaxies on my driveway and apologized too many times until I gave the kid a pack of neon pastels and said to leave Saturn right in front of the garage, so I would have to step over a ringed planet every time I left for work. And with each small exchange, the house stopped being a proof of purchase and started being a home that answered back. A place that held me without asking for spectacle, which is a luxury you do not recognize until your applause section goes on strike. The housewarming, the one they were never meant to hear about, unfurled like a private amnesty, not loud and not curated for photographs that would impress relatives who treat compliments like coupons with expiration dates, but real and warm and a little chaotic. With lanterns strung low across the backyard where the fence still leaned like an old man and an orchestra of mismatched chairs gathered around borrowed folding tables draped in thrifted linen, and, because I wanted a record that would feel more permanent than posts that wash away, I set a guest book on the entry table with a fountain pen and asked people to write what they thought I would need to read on hard days rather than generic congratulations, and what they wrote was not decorative. It was a ledger of witnesses, reminders that I had been relentless, kind, infuriatingly stubborn, sometimes wrong, and then brave enough to fix it, and though I do not cry easily, I felt my throat tighten when a colleague who does not perform feelings wrote that I deserved a room that did not steal oxygen from me. There was a detail about that night I did not tell anyone outside that room, because it sounded petty when said out loud even though it felt like justice under my hands, and it sat in my dining room with the silence of a settled argument. The table. Not just any table, but the heavy oak rectangle from my grandmother's house with the dovetailed leaves, and the pencil marks from a generation of children measuring their height on one apron. The table my mother had treated like a crown jewel for years while promising, with the airy certainty of a queen appointing heirs, that it would be my brother's someday because he will host bigger holidays, a sentence delivered with a breezy cruelty that could pass as planning if you ignored the subtext. And then the aunt who stored it after the estate sale called me one afternoon to say she was moving to a smaller place, that no one had picked it up, and that if I wanted it she would rather see me use it than watch it languish under a tarp, so I drove over with a rented van, peeled 20s from an envelope I had labeled with a joke about dowries, and carried the thing into my house with the reverence of a person reclaiming narrative rights to her own childhood. I cleaned it, oiled it. And when the party spilled inside because the night got cold, I watched people rest their elbows on the wood where my mother once snapped at me for doing the same, and I felt a spine of satisfaction that had nothing to do with humiliation and everything to do with standing where someone tried to tell me I would never stand. Because I have learned that memory is slippery and families excel at rewriting scenes to suit their reflection, I kept documentation the way a cautious person keeps flashlights. Not because I wanted a courtroom, but because I wanted to be able to repeat the truth without flinching. So there is a linen envelope inside my purse that contains a tidy stack of printed photographs from that night. My neighbor's chalk-smeared daughter blowing out candles she insisted were for me, the retired teacher teaching two tech bros how to fold a proper napkin, a friend from my first job grinning with her shoes in her hand and a smear of frosting on her wrist. And behind those images is a crisp bill of sale from my aunt with the table's measurements written in her looping script, and tucked at the very back is a sealed card addressed to my mother in my own handwriting that says, "For when you ask me to catch up," which I wrote after the third time she turned a normal conversation into a race that only counted if my brother was watching. I am not naive about the limits of proof, since some people will look straight at your evidence and call it lighting, yet I have found that revenge does not need to roar to be effective. Especially when the tactic is the removal of assumed privileges rather than a scene in a restaurant, and, because I knew this dinner was coming in some form, I can feel the build of these moments the way old houses feel storms. I set a small mechanism in motion that would not look like a mechanism at all, a simple scheduled message arranged days ago with my aunt who still remembers what fairness sounds like, a text that would ping my mother's phone later in the evening with a single photo of my dining room glowing under the pendant light, the oak table set with the mismatched plates from the housewarming, and a caption that reads, "Finally found the right home," a sentence that says nothing insulting and everything necessary, which will land in her palm like a friendly meteor at precisely the moment when she thinks the conversation has cooled. Back at the restaurant, I tracked the time not by the wall clock, but by the pace of the conversation as it tried to patch itself into something civil. And when my mother began an anecdote about my brother's contractor that aimed to reassert the hierarchy by praising men who install things while ignoring women who pay for them, my phone vibrated lightly in my purse. A prearranged tremor that told me the photo had been sent, and I watched her glance down at her screen with that reflexive flicker. Every adult swears they have under control. I watched the focus in her eyes sharpen and then stall, and I did nothing except lift my glass like the most polite accomplice to my own emancipation. Because the next sounds around that table would tell me whether she could look at a picture of my life and see me in it, or whether the fork would stop in the air again, and either way, I was ready to let the silence do the talking. My mother's expression changed in stages that would have been funny if they had not been so familiar. The quick spark of curiosity that always preceded gossip giving way to a tightening around the mouth as the picture on her phone resolved into something that refused to be narrated into a minor footnote. The polished oak table she had promised elsewhere standing in the warm circle of my dining room light with a plain linen runner and the mismatched plates from the night I decided to celebrate. Without an audience, and although the photo was almost aggressively polite, no caption except the tidy, finally found the right home, I watched it land on her face like a truth that did not ask permission. A reminder that objects she treated as proof of hierarchy could choose new meanings the moment the people around them did, which is exactly the kind of quiet revenge I had designed for this evening because arguments exhaust me while evidence, when properly timed, does not raise its voice at all. She blinked hard, looked up as if the restaurant's dim wall sconces might offer a counterargument, and tried to reset the tone with a comment about how certain antiques need special care, which was her delicate way of demanding an explanation without making a direct request. But I let the silence round out her sentence, and then I told her, gently enough to be civil and sharp enough to be remembered, that the table had been offered to me by the aunt who actually paid the storage fees, that I had signed a bill of sale written in the same looping script that labeled the drawers of our grandmother's sewing chest, that I had restored the wood by hand because respect is not a speech but a task, and that I planned to host holidays there when it suited me rather than when it proved a point for anyone else, after which I returned to my pasta like a woman who has learned the difference between permission and ownership. And for a breath I saw my father consider smiling, which he did not do. Because habit is stronger than impulse in men who have survived on caution. Ryan leaned forward with the breezy confidence of a person who has never had to pull the heavy end of a plan and announced that it was weird to hide a house as if secrecy were a character flaw rather than a safety rail, then launched into a lightly mocking description of how our family likes to celebrate milestones as a team, by which he meant that he enjoys stepping into rooms already prepared by other people. And I answered that it is easy to confuse a parade for solidarity when you have always been the float, which made him laugh for half a second before the meaning caught up, and then he took the predictable route and asked whether I expected a medal for paying my own bills. So I said that I do not collect medals, I collect boundaries, and that the only reason any of this looks dramatic is because the usual script in which I apologize first has been retired for lack of audience. My mother tried a different angle. The maternal lament that begins with concern and ends with a little moral invoice, telling me that shutting out family hardens a person, and that hardness is not a virtue in a woman who might someday need soft places to land. And I nodded as if the sentiment were not dressed in condescension and said that I have soft places, they just do not charge interest, at which point my father, who has spent a lifetime avoiding the center of conversations, asked whether I had at least let them send a gift for the house, and I told him I had not, because gifts from people who catalog them are better left undelivered, and then, because I felt the old habit of defending myself flicker like an emergency light, and I refused to feed it, I pivoted to specificity, the only solvent for family myths, and reminded Ryan that he had asked me for a bridge loan when his contractor discovered mold that conveniently appeared after he chose the cheapest estimate that I had offered a simple written agreement with dates and amounts and a clause in plain language meant to save us both from amnesia, and that he had laughed, called me dramatic, and told Mom that I was holding the family hostage to paperwork. A phrase she repeated to two aunts who repeat everything except the details that might incriminate their favorite son. The server arrived with a dessert menu we did not need and a kindness I wanted to tip double, and while she described the flourless chocolate cake in a tone that could have ended any war, I decided that tonight's revenge would not be the headline-grabbing kind, but a careful accounting of how stories get built. So I turned to my mother and told her, without elevation and without apology, that while she was busy organizing my brother's housewarming, she had missed the small scholarship I created. At the community college where I once copied handouts, a yearly line item in our family name for students working more than one job, which was not a performance, but an antidote to the way she speaks about generosity as if it were theater seats we compete to fill. I watched her imagine the letter that must have arrived, the one she skimmed for flattery and then put aside. And I saw her realize that the narrative she loves of herself as the patron saint of showing up had developed an inconvenient footnote that refused to vanish just because she preferred the tidy version. Ryan tried to detonate a distraction by revealing that his refinance had fallen through, a flimsy grenade he assumed would pull all eyes back to him, and when he asked whether I would at least co-sign as family, I told him that I do not put my name on things I do not control, and that if he wanted a partner, he should hire one, not conscript a sister who learned to read loan documents before she learned to pronounce appetizer specials. And while he made a face he has perfected since childhood, the blend of incredulity and injury that works on anyone who fears being unkind, I simply reached into my purse, felt the cool texture of the linen envelope that has waited through one quiet year for this exact set of sentences, and set it on the table between my plate and my mother's phone with the same ordinary care a person uses to place a napkin, then rested my fingertips on the flap and told my mother that if she truly wanted to understand what she had missed, she could open it now or she could open it later, but either way the room she thinks she knows is about to rearrange itself, and I watched her eyes drop to the edge of the paper while the entire table held its breath as if air were suddenly rationed. My mother did not rush the envelope the way she rushes gossip. She lifted the flap with a care that suggested she already understood that speed would not help her, and as she slid her fingertips inside and drew out the first layer, a neat stack of matte prints held with a linen ribbon the color of tea, she studied each photograph as though it might blink and confess that it was staged. The backyard hung with low lanterns and the leaning fence and the chalk rings of Saturn still ghosting the driveway. The oak table burnished and surrounded by people whose names she does not know and whose faces hold the uncomplicated affection of those who have celebrated not the furniture, but the person eating at it. And while she stared with that tight line of concentration that has always preceded a revision of history, I let the room hear the small, steady drum of the restaurant, the clink of cutlery, and the patient shuffle of the server. Because ordinary sounds make revelations feel less like theater and more like weather that finally arrived. Behind the photographs came the bill of sale folded into thirds with my aunt's looping signature anchoring the bottom and a line that reads paid in full written in the kind of uncompromising ink that does not fade when it is convenient. And beneath that a copy of the letter from the community college thanking our family for a modest scholarship that will, for a few students each year, turn impossible schedules into survivable ones. The letter that had been mailed months ago and probably skimmed for flattery before it was buried under circulars, and then the little rectangle that made my brother clear his throat in a rush, my plain, brutally boring one-page loan agreement template with his name on the first line and every other space intentionally blank, a document that asks nothing heroic from anyone except honesty and memory. And I watched him process the fact that the blankness did not prove I was stingy, but proved that he had refused to pick up a pen when handed a chance to be taken seriously. At the bottom lay the thing I had sealed a year ago with the detachment of a surgeon who knows that true repair often requires cutting away flesh that still insists it is necessary. A card addressed to my mother in handwriting neat enough to be a stranger's that began with the sentence, "I never learned how to make you proud without making myself small," and continued in a steady line that did not wobble, explaining that I had not invited them to the housewarming because I wanted to hear a voice in My own rooms that was not immediately corrected or compared, that I had not accepted money because I wanted to remember exactly what things cost me and therefore remember to be gentle with other people when they are paying. That I had reclaimed the table not to taunt anyone but to eat at the one surface in our family that seemed to determine who counted as the host of a life. And that I would keep offering them the version of me that does not need a referee if they were willing to meet me as a grown woman rather than a runner on a track with her brother's footsteps amplified through a megaphone. 2 keys rested inside the card in a tiny glassine sleeve, 1 brass and 1 dark nickel. And when she looked up with a question already forming, I told her that the brass key opened my front door and the nickel one opened nothing at all because it was a copy that had never been cut to match any lock, a reminder that access without respect is just noise. And I said it not as a riddle, but as an offer with terms that any adult should be able to honor, a simple agreement that whoever holds a key also holds responsibility for the air in the room, which means you do not bring comparisons as a centerpiece and you do not count someone else's luck like it was your own bank account, and you do not come inside to take inventory where you have not invested love. My brother tried for bravado that wobbled at the edges and said the keys were a stunt and the photos were curated and the table would have looked better in a larger dining room, which made me laugh because his insults have always been geometry disguised as taste. And I told him that he could sign the loan template tonight if he wanted to solve a real problem with real terms, or he could keep performing measurement for an audience that is dwindling by the minute, after which I turned back to my mother and added that if she decided to keep the brass key she would be welcome to use it on any evening she could walk through a door without asking who I was competing with, and that if she preferred the nickel key, which opens nothing and yet rattles in the pocket like importance, she could keep it as a reminder of the old way, the one where she held a symbol and mistook it for closeness. For a long stretch the only movement at our table was my father's hand reaching for his water with the slowness of a man who knows any sound may shatter whatever fragile shape this moment is making. And then my mother set the photographs down as if they were warm and asked in a voice I did not recognize whether the scholarship was truly in our family name, whether I had meant for it to be a surprise, whether I had believed for even a second that she would not want to show up if invited, and I told her the truth that sounds cruel when you first hear it, that she has always wanted to show up for the version of me that flatters her myths, that she will need to learn to show up for the one who contradicts them. And that I did not throw a party to teach anyone a lesson, but to stand in a house that did not take air from my lungs, which is something I am not willing to lose again, not even to keep a peace that never fed me. She picked up the brass key, held it on her palm like a tiny verdict, and for a heartbeat I thought she might slide it back toward me with some remark about conditions and punishments, but instead she closed her fingers around it, the way a person closes a gate to keep something in rather than out, and she nodded without speaking, which would have been a perfect ending if life respected narrative arcs. But then she lifted the nickel key too and tucked it into her purse, a gesture that could mean she is collecting symbols as insurance, or that she intends to sit with both possibilities until she decides who she is going to be, and I found that I did not need to interpret it because the point was never to trap her in an answer. It was to make it impossible for any of us to return to a conversation where the only question is when I will catch up. We left the restaurant in the soft dark of a street that does not care who is winning, my father stepping out to the curb as if the night might trip him without warning, my brother checking his phone for the attention that always finds him, my mother walking a half step behind me with the careful posture of someone learning a new instrument, and as I unlocked my car I heard the faint buzz of her message arriving somewhere far away in the group chat that used to narrate my life in absentia, and I did not ask to see it because I was done auditing them for signs of comprehension. I was done measuring their progress like a project that required tracking, and I chose the smaller revenge that grows into a life, which is to go home to a room where my voice does not have to win to be heard, a room that will open to a brass key when it arrives with respect and remain closed to anything else. And while I drove I let the almost unbearable relief of ambiguity settle around me like weather. Because I do not know whether my mother will use the right key or pocket both and pretend she lost them. I do not know whether my brother will sign a line with his own hand or keep borrowing pens to avoid responsibility. I do not know whether the next holiday will be a new ritual or a replay with better lighting, and the strangest thing is that I am finally comfortable not knowing, because catching up turned out to be an illusion that evaporates the moment you stop running. And once it is gone, the only race left is the one toward your own front door.